The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. For the kingdom of heaven is as a man travelling into a far country, who called his own servants, and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them 5 other talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained other 2. But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth, and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants cometh, and reckoneth with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came, and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliveredst unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou deliveredst unto me 2 talents. Behold, I have gained 2 other talents beside them. His Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Then he which had received 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee that thou art a hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this second reading from chapter 25 of Matthew, we are once again with Jesus and his disciples on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple in Jerusalem, in the evening of the Tuesday of Holy Week. As I've mentioned a number of times, in chapter 24 there was the long reply of Jesus to the question of his disciples, when will the temple fall, and when will be the second coming? And we discussed at length in a number of readings the intricate answer to those questions by Jesus in chapter 24. And then in Matthew, continuing in the same setting, chapter 25 comprises 3 parables. And the first parable was yesterday's reading of the 10 virgins or 10 bridesmaids, 5 of whom were wise and 5 were foolish, which was a parable about remaining alert and prepared for the coming of the Lord. Now in this lengthy second parable, the lesson is not so much about watchfulness, the lesson is about living the active gospel and using one's abilities, indeed one's talents, to the best of one's abilities to serve the Lord. And in fact, our word talent actually comes in English from this very parable. So in this parable then, Jesus paints a picture of a wealthy man who is going on a journey into a far country, and he calls his servants and puts his goods into their hands so that they can essentially look after his goods and his wealth. And apparently this was not an uncommon scenario in the Holy Land in those days, that long-term servants of wealthy people were essentially trusted to look after their belongings and their wealth if they were on long journeys. Now in verse 15 we read that one servant was entrusted with 5 talents, another servant was entrusted with 2 talents, and a third servant was entrusted with 1 talent. Now a talent was a huge sum. It was essentially a very large measure of weight of silver, corresponding to several dozen pounds. I mean, the weight pounds, so dozens of kilograms of silver, a very, very large amount. One commentator says that in those days it would be equivalent to about 3,000 shekels. So a really very, very large sum. So these servants are not, people that carry dishes. These would be people that are quite high up in the household of this wealthy man, who are very trustworthy, and he's entrusting one with 5 measures of this very large amount of silver, to another 2, and to another 1. And we read, to every man according to his several abilities. So the servant who was entrusted with 5 talents, that would be equivalent to something like 15,000 shekels worth of value, would be someone who presumably, according to that wealthy man, was very talented, was a very able servant, maybe had a good eye for enterprise, and would be able to set up maybe some business on the side, or to invest in someone else's business to essentially make that wealth of the wealthy man work and earn interest. And the servant that received 2 talents would be someone also with abilities, but not maybe as sharp as the first servant. And then the third servant receiving 1 talent, clearly able, because he's entrusted with 3,000 shekels worth of value, but not as able as the other 2. Now we read that in the interval before the return of the Lord, and we do read in verse 19 that it's a long time before the Lord returns, so this may be indeed several years, that servant has traded, and in the original Greek it would be more that he had essentially worked with that wealth. So that may be that he started up business, or he invested in other businesses to make that money useful, and had essentially turned the 5 talents worth of value into 10 total by using it in profitable businesses. Similarly, the servant that had received 2 did likewise, and managed to double the value of the 2 talents that he'd received. Now the point of this parable is what happens to the third servant. He did not make the wealth work. He did not invest it or use it to start up an enterprise. As we learn, he was very timid and worried, and he just didn't want to lose the money, so he just dug a hole, hid the money, covered it over, and just waited for his Lord's return. Now in verse 19 we learn that after a long time the wealthy man returns and then meets with the 3 servants and finds out how they got on. Something that's very pertinent here, because this is a parable, and in the parable, mapping it back to the gospel, the wealthy man, of course, corresponds to the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and this is about the second coming. Note how it's after a long time that the Lord cometh, and Jesus is telling the disciples in this parable after a long time. Remember in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, how they all slumbered and slept because the wedding party was very much later than they expected. And that was why the foolish bridesmaids, their lamps went out, because they didn't have additional oil. So in the first parable we have this very lengthy, longer than expected time before the return of the bridegroom and the wedding party. Here in the second parable, after a very lengthy time, the wealthy man returns. Jesus, within these parables, is signaling to his disciples that even though no man knoweth, not the angels in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father, when the second coming will be, he's signaling very, very clearly to his disciples it's going to be a long time, much longer than they expect. And indeed, we know that it's longer than 2,000 years. Back to the parable, after a long time, the wealthy man returns. He meets with the first servant, who proudly tells his Lord that he has made the 5 talents work in enterprise, and he has earned 5 additional talents. And the Lord is very pleased and calls him a good and faithful servant. And the servant has been faithful in overseeing a few things, and that he's going to give him more responsibility in the future, and says to the servant, "Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord," which we can think of maybe in the parable as that the servant is now elevated to be far more trusted and is somehow in the inner circle of that wealthy man's life, almost adopted into the family. Similarly, with the servant who had doubled the value of the 2 talents, he very proudly says to his Lord that he has gained 2 more talents, doubled the value. And the wealthy man says to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and essentially the same language. "You've been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. I will give you more, essentially more talents, so that you can make those talents work. Enter into the joy of the Lord," bringing again that second servant into the inner circle. Again, within the parable then, mapping this back to the second coming, the way that we can think about this is that for those Christians, for those servants of the gospel who are productive and who are using the gifts that they have been given, so the talents, literally the abilities for the work of the gospel, then they will enter into the joy of thy Lord. They will enter into the presence of Christ and of the Father in the kingdom of heaven. Commentators are not sure what to make of the phrase, "I will make thee ruler over many things." It could be an inkling into the nature of the kingdom of heaven, but it's really unknown to us. We only have this glimpse, and we can only really just guess what that might mean. But the clear message is that each person, and I believe this to the core of my being, that each person has abilities. Each person is unique. Each person should be loved and prized because they are unique. And each person has talents and abilities that can be used. And one crucial responsibility of society is to raise and educate and nurture children so that their talents, their intrinsic abilities are nourished and made as vibrant and wonderful as possible, so that those young people can be productive and enjoy their abilities and that others can gain value from those abilities. And it's a tragedy when a child's abilities are not nurtured and go to waste, and often through no fault of the child, just through the wrong kind of environment. But assuming that a child has been raised and is now an adult and has these abilities and has been raised well, and these abilities are all primed to be used, it is a duty for a Christian to use those abilities for the good of others, for the active gospel in loving God and loving their fellow man as themselves. And so those first two servants have used their abilities for the good of others. It reminds us of, yet again, we keep coming back to that parable of the seed sown. The seed that fell on fertile soil was fruitful, multiplying 30, 60, 100-fold. It's that same concept of fruitfulness, using one's abilities, one's unique characteristics in a loving way to provide value in terms of the active gospel. And that can mean evangelism, that can mean helping those in need, that can mean providing love and care to those in need. Many different ways in which this active gospel can be lived. But now we come to the third servant, and this is where the parable has a slightly more nuanced, I think, and subtle message. Because this servant did not, like the poor, I say poor, the poor in the sense of not good, so the ineffective and wicked servant at the end of chapter 24, who when his Lord was away, beat the other servants and invited drunkards into the house and just assumed the Lord wasn't coming back for a long time and just essentially lived a debauched life. He was a wicked servant and was dealt with accordingly when the Lord returned at an hour that he did not expect. This servant here, though, is not wicked per se, but he wastes his ability, he wastes the talent, because he lacks faith, actually. He lacks faith. He says that he was afraid. He says to the Lord, I know that you're a hard man, a stern man. Now, we haven't had that sense of sternness from this wealthy man in the rest of the parable, actually. He's very trusting and very generous, because when he meets the two servants, he's so pleased with what they've done. He's given them more responsibility and brought them into his inner circle. He's entrusted this third servant with responsibility in a very loving way before he goes on his journey. And so this sounds actually like an insincere excuse. I know that you're a stern man. I know that you reap where you have not sown, so you take value where you've not placed value. You've gathered where you have not strawed, and strawed was another word for the winnowing of the wheat from the chaff. And so he's saying essentially that you're taking wheat from the garner floor even though you haven't garnered, you haven't done the winnowing. And because you're stern and because you take value where you haven't planted value, I was afraid that if I lost the money, maybe I would be punished. So I just hid that silver in the earth until you came back. And look, here it is. You've got it all back. There's your talent, your 3,000 shekels. So the Lord is utterly unimpressed and says, you're a wicked and lazy servant. And in this next part, what he's really saying, the Lord, is, if you knew that I was stern and took value where I had not planted value, and that I essentially steal, I gather wheat where I have not winnowed, if you believed that, the least you could have done, if you really believed that, the least you could have done was to at least put that money to the exchangers, the money lenders, even though that's not a virtuous thing to do, but you could have done that so that at least it would have earned some interest. The other two servants were doing enterprising things with the money in terms of creating businesses and services for those around them, or investing in other people trying to set up businesses. So it was useful. But the least that this third servant could have done, if they were really that frightened, was to at least give the money to the moneylenders, and it would be guaranteed to earn interest. Usury, of course, was seen in a very double-edged way. It was essentially seen as a sinful activity, particularly because often the interest rates of lending were crippling to people. So the wealthy man is really hanging the servant by his own petard, because he's saying that, you're slandering me, you're painting a picture of me that isn't correct. But even if that picture were correct, you could have given that money to the moneylenders, and at least you'd have given me something back in terms of interest. But instead, you've done nothing, and then you've just made excuses and culminated, if that's the right word. I think that's the word, culminated me. So he then says to his entourage, take that talent from the servant and give it to him that has the 10, because that servant will be enterprising with that. That 11th talent will create great value. So it will be useful finally, instead of being buried in the earth for all these years. And then Jesus gives this lesson: for unto everyone that hath shall be given, for everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. So those that use their abilities, they will have more abilities. They will get more insight, more ability, more spiritual energy from using those abilities. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. So if someone has an ability and it just shrivels up and it's not used, eventually it will just die. It will be taken away, and he'll have nothing. That person will have nothing of their innate abilities to use for the good of the Lord. And ending the parable, the wealthy man says, cast this unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There we have again Gehenna. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So these two parables in this chapter 25, the first one with the 10 bridesmaids teaching us about preparedness and alertness for the coming of the Lord, and the second one teaching us about living the active gospel and using our innate talents that we've been given by the Lord. The Lord has given us these talents. We should use them for the Lord. And that means helping others, loving others, using these talents. And that is our way of paying the Lord in return for having these talents from him in our creation. And so, two very important lessons, and the fact that if one is not prepared and alert, as in the first parable, or if one squanders these talents or does not use the talents for the good of the Lord, this is wicked. This is wickedness. Even though it's not overtly sinful in the sense of a bridesmaid eloping with someone and not even coming to the wedding, or this servant with the 1 talent just absconding with it and living a debauched life. That's pure wickedness. But it's wicked to be unprepared. It's wicked to waste the abilities that God has given us if we do not use them in his name.